She left her failed husband for a doctor. He became a millionaire chef, and she cried at his restaurant. Patricia Williams slammed the divorce papers on the kitchen counter while Robert Miller stood there in his stained apron, flour still dusting his hands from the batch of homemade meals he'd been preparing for delivery. Her nurse scrubs were pristine white, a stark contrast to his worn-out clothes and the makeshift kitchen that had taken over their tiny one-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas. The smell of onions and garlic filled the air, but her face showed nothing but disgust as she pointed at the stack of takeout containers covering every surface. "I can't do this anymore, Robert. 8 months of this embarrassment." Her voice cut through him like a blade, each word carefully chosen to wound. The man who once commanded a bustling restaurant kitchen now looked like a broken shadow of himself, stirring a pot of soup with shaking hands while she gathered her belongings with military precision. Steam rose from the stove, fogging up the small window that overlooked the parking lot where his old delivery car sat, with a dented bumper and fading paint. "I met someone who actually has his life together," she continued, her engagement ring from Dr. Richard Thompson catching the dim overhead light. "Someone who doesn't turn our bedroom into a food truck." The way she said "food truck" made it sound like the worst insult imaginable. Robert's throat tightened as he watched her pack the last of her medical textbooks, the same books he'd helped her study from during nursing school, when money was even tighter than it was now. The apartment felt smaller with each item she removed, as if the walls were closing in around the makeshift cooking station that had become his only source of income. "Patricia, please, the restaurant business will bounce back. This is just temporary until—" But she cut him off with a laugh so cold it made him step backward. "Temporary? Robert, you're 38 years old selling lunchboxes like a teenager. Dr. Thompson owns 3 clinics. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "I want a man with ambition, not someone who gave up and decided to play house in our living room." The sound of her heels clicking down the hallway echoed back through the thin walls as Robert stood motionless, surrounded by the chaos of his one-man catering operation. Pots and pans covered the dining table, ingredients filled every corner, and the smell of his grandmother's recipes hung in the air like ghosts of better times. When the front door finally slammed shut, the silence that followed was deafening. The first tear fell into the soup he was stirring, followed by another, then another, until his shoulders began to shake uncontrollably. He had lost everything in a matter of months. His job at Rosario's Italian kitchen when the pandemic hit, his wife's respect, his sense of purpose, and now the one person who was supposed to stand by him through the worst of times. The apartment suddenly felt like a prison cell, with aluminum containers stacked against the walls like bars, and the lingering scent of his failures cooking on every burner. All he had left were his grandmother Rose's old recipes and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would pay $15 for a homemade meal delivered by a broken man. But even through the tears, something burned deep in his chest. Not just pain, but a fierce determination that scared him with its intensity. As he wiped his face with the back of his flour-covered hand, leaving white streaks across his cheeks, Robert Miller made a silent promise to the empty apartment. The woman who walked out that door would one day see exactly what she had thrown away, and when that moment came, she would be the one begging for scraps. He turned back to the stove with renewed focus, stirring the soup with steady hands as the first chapter of his comeback story began to simmer. The sound of his phone buzzing with a delivery order broke through his thoughts, and for the first time in 8 months, Robert smiled through his tears. Each ring was another chance, another customer, another step away from the man Patricia had left behind. He carefully ladled the soup into containers, sealed them with the same precision he once used in professional kitchens, and grabbed his car keys with hands that no longer shook. The game was far from over. 3 weeks after Patricia walked out, Robert sat on the floor of his empty apartment eating cold soup straight from the pot, too exhausted to heat it up or find a clean bowl. The divorce papers lay signed on the coffee table next to a stack of unpaid bills that seemed to grow taller each day, mocking him with their red stamped warnings and final notices. His back ached from sleeping on the couch every night, having converted the bedroom into a full-scale commercial kitchen, complete with industrial shelving and a chest freezer he'd bought with his last credit card. The transformation was complete. He no longer lived in a home, but in a food production facility that happened to have a bathroom. The walls were stained with grease and steam, creating abstract patterns that told the story of his desperation in shades of brown and yellow. His phone buzzed constantly with delivery orders, but the money barely covered rent and ingredients, leaving him surviving on the same meals he prepared for customers. Sleep came in 2-hour intervals between prep work and delivery runs, his body running on caffeine and the bitter fuel of humiliation. Every morning he woke up on that sagging couch, staring at the ceiling where water stains had formed the shape of his broken dreams. When he drove through Austin delivering meals in his battered Honda Civic, he sometimes caught glimpses of Patricia and Dr. Thompson at upscale restaurants through their floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore designer dresses now, laughing at something the distinguished doctor said while cutting into steaks that cost more than Robert made in 3 days. The sight of her happiness felt like swallowing broken glass. But he forced himself to keep driving, to keep delivering, to keep grinding even when every bone in his body screamed for rest. These moments became his fuel, each laugh she shared with another man, adding another log to the fire burning in his chest. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday, when his car broke down in the middle of a delivery run, leaving him stranded in a grocery store parking lot with $50 worth of hot meals growing cold in the back seat. He called every tow truck in the city, but without money up front, no one would help. Rain soaked through his jacket as he stood outside the car, watching steam rise from the containers while his customers called, demanding their food or their money back. That night, he walked 12 miles home in the downpour, carrying empty containers and the weight of another failed day. But something extraordinary happened during that long walk through the storm. Robert began to remember who he used to be before the world knocked him down. He thought about his grandmother Rose, who had immigrated from Italy with nothing but recipes and an unbreakable spirit, building a life in America one meal at a time. Her voice echoed in his mind, speaking the words she used to whisper while teaching him to cook. Roberto, food is love made visible. When you cook with your heart, people taste your soul. Those old memories mixed with the rain running down his face, washing away months of self-pity and revealing something harder underneath. By the time he reached his apartment, soaked to the bone and exhausted beyond measure, Robert Miller had made a decision that would change everything. He stood in his makeshift kitchen, looking at the chaos of his survival, and began to see it differently. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the foundation of something bigger. Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every meal delivered with shaking hands had been building toward this moment of clarity. The man Patricia had left for dead was about to prove her spectacularly wrong. He spent that night not sleeping, but planning, sketching business ideas on napkins and researching small business loans on his cracked phone screen. The apartment that had felt like a prison began to feel like a laboratory, a place where he could experiment and create without anyone watching or judging. For the first time in months, Robert looked in the bathroom mirror and saw not a failure, but a man who had been tested by fire and refused to burn. The hardest part was over. Now came the rising. When dawn broke over Austin, Robert Miller was still awake, but he was no longer the same man who had been abandoned 3 weeks earlier. He had discovered something precious in the wreckage of his old life. The absolute certainty that he would rather die trying than live defeated. The war had begun, and he intended to win it one meal at a time. Robert's salvation came in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a 78-year-old widow who lived in the apartment complex across the street and had been ordering his meals twice a week since Patricia left. She appeared at his door on a Tuesday morning when the electricity had been shut off, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of gentle smile that reminded him of his grandmother Rose. "Honey, I've been watching you work yourself to death over there," she said, pushing past him into the dark apartment with the confidence of someone who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "You're going to kill yourself living like this." Her weathered hands moved through his makeshift kitchen with surprising efficiency, examining his ingredients and tasting his sauces with the critical palate of someone who had been cooking for 6 decades. The morning light streaming through her open doorway illuminated the chaos of his existence. Empty energy drink cans, towels draped over every surface, and the lingerie Patricia had left behind still hanging in the bathroom like ghosts of better times. "This food is restaurant quality. Maybe better," Mrs. Henderson declared, settling into his only chair while he stood awkwardly by the stove. "But you're running a business like a teenager selling lemonade." She pulled a worn leather checkbook from her purse and wrote him a check for $5,000, pressing it into his flour-dusted hands despite his protests. "My late husband Harry owned 3 restaurants before he passed," she explained, her eyes twinkling with mischief and memory. "I know talent when I taste it, and I know stupid when I see it. You're both." The check felt like a lifeline in his hands, but more than the money was the recognition in her voice. Someone finally saw what he was trying to build instead of what he had lost. Under Mrs. Henderson's guidance, Robert began to transform his operation from desperate survival into strategic growth. She helped him register as a legitimate business, Grandma Rose's Kitchen, and taught him how to batch cook efficiently while maintaining quality. Her own kitchen became his testing ground, where she would critique new recipes with the brutal honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to give. "Too much salt," she would declare, or "This needs more love, honey. I can taste your anger." Slowly, he learned to cook with hope instead of desperation. The first real breakthrough came when Mrs. Henderson convinced her book club to order catering for their monthly meeting. 12 sophisticated women from the upscale neighborhoods of West Austin gathered around her dining room table, sampling Robert's modern takes on classic comfort food. They ate in reverent silence, then began asking questions. "Who made this? Can we hire him for our bridge tournament? Does he do dinner parties?" By the end of the evening, Robert had 3 new catering gigs and a business card designed by Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter. Word spread through Austin's social circles like wildfire. Robert's food had something the expensive restaurants lacked: soul. Each dish carried the weight of his struggle, the love of his grandmother's teachings, and the precision learned from years in professional kitchens. His mac and cheese wasn't just comfort food, it was edible therapy. His braised short ribs didn't just satisfy hunger, they healed hearts. People began requesting him specifically for their most important gatherings because somehow, impossibly, his food made them feel less alone. 6 months after Mrs. Henderson knocked on his door, Robert had moved into a small commercial kitchen space in East Austin, complete with proper equipment and health department approval. He still lived in the same apartment, but now it felt like a choice rather than a trap. The bedroom had been converted back into a bedroom, and for the first time since Patricia left, he slept through the night without waking up in a panic about money or failure. His phone rang constantly with catering requests, and he had hired his first employee, a young culinary student named Marcus, who reminded him of himself at 25. As he locked up the kitchen one evening, watching the Austin skyline light up against the darkening sky, Robert felt something he had almost forgotten: pride. Not the fragile, ego-driven pride that could be shattered by one woman's rejection, but the deep, unshakable pride that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands. Mrs. Henderson had given him more than money. She had given him back his future. And somewhere across town, in a restaurant she would never be able to afford, Patricia was probably cutting into another expensive steak, completely unaware that the man she had discarded was quietly becoming the most sought-after chef in Austin. The turning point arrived through an unlikely source: Austin Food and Wine magazine's anonymous food critic, who had been following Robert's catering operation for months after attending one of Mrs. Henderson's book club dinners. The review appeared on a Wednesday morning with a headline that made Robert's hands shake as he read it on his phone. Hidden gem: Grandma Rose's Kitchen delivers Austin's most authentic comfort food experience. The critic described his braised short ribs as a revelation, and his cornbread as what nostalgia would taste like if it could be eaten. By noon, his phone had received more orders than he typically got in a week. The article brought attention from food bloggers, Instagram influencers, and most importantly, restaurant investors who had been watching Austin's food scene for the next big opportunity. Robert found himself fielding calls from people offering partnerships, franchise opportunities, and investment deals that 6 months earlier would have seemed like impossible dreams. But Mrs. Henderson's wisdom echoed in his mind. "Honey, when opportunity knocks, you better be ready to cook for it." He had learned patience in the crucible of his breakdown, and now that patience would serve him well. 3 potential investors emerged from the chaos: a restaurant group from Dallas, a local food truck empire owner, and most intriguingly, a former tech executive named Sarah Chen, who had made millions in software before deciding to pursue her passion for food businesses. Sarah was different from the others. She sat in his tiny kitchen for 4 hours, asking detailed questions about his recipes, his vision, and his grandmother's influence on his cooking. "I don't just invest in food," she told him over a plate of his famous chicken and dumplings. "I invest in stories, and your story isn't finished yet." The partnership with Sarah gave Robert access to capital, business expertise, and most crucially, someone who understood that his food wasn't just about profit margins, it was about healing. Together, they found the perfect location, a converted warehouse in the trendy South First District, with exposed brick walls and enough space for both a restaurant and a test kitchen for future locations. The renovation took 4 months, during which Robert continued catering while dreaming about the restaurant that would bear his grandmother's name and his own reinvention. Opening night at Grandma Rose's Kitchen restaurant was a surreal experience for a man who had been sleeping on a couch a year earlier. The dining room filled with Austin's food elite, social media personalities, and the loyal customers who had supported him through his catering days. Mrs. Henderson sat at the best table, wearing a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, and beaming with maternal pride as reporters interviewed Robert about his journey from delivery driver to restaurant owner. The kitchen hummed with controlled chaos as he and his team of 6 chefs executed a menu that balanced elevated technique with the soul-warming comfort of home cooking. The restaurant's success exceeded every projection Sarah had made in her business plan. Within 3 months, they had a 2-week waiting list for dinner reservations and had been featured in Food and Wine, Southern Living, and Texas Monthly. Robert's face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The Chef Who Cooked His Way Back" and "From Broken to Brilliant, Austin's Comeback King." But the moment that mattered most came when a food critic from the New York Times called Grandma Rose's Kitchen the most emotionally resonant restaurant experience in America, noting that every dish seems to understand your hunger before you do. The financial transformation was staggering, but somehow felt secondary to the emotional healing. Robert moved into a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Austin, complete with a modern kitchen where he cooked for pleasure rather than survival. His bank account showed numbers that would have seemed fictional 2 years earlier, but more importantly, he had built something meaningful, a place where people came not just to eat, but to be comforted. Food and Wine named him one of America's best new chefs, and the James Beard Foundation nominated Grandma Rose's Kitchen for Outstanding New Restaurant. As he stood in his restaurant's kitchen one evening, watching his team prepare hundreds of meals with the precision of a symphony orchestra, Robert caught his reflection in the stainless steel surface of a prep counter. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the broken figure Patricia had left behind. This version had clear eyes, confident hands, and the quiet strength that comes from proving to yourself that you are capable of anything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to be grateful for the woman who had unwittingly given him the greatest gift of his life, the chance to discover who he really was when everything else was stripped away. The expansion to 3 locations happened faster than Robert had dared to imagine. Each new Grandma Rose's Kitchen establishing itself as the crown jewel of its neighborhood within months of opening. The second location in downtown Dallas attracted a celebrity clientele that included professional athletes and politicians, while the third location in Houston became the go-to spot for food industry professionals who drove hours just to experience what food critics were calling emotional gastronomy. Robert found himself managing an empire that employed over 120 people, each trained in his philosophy that cooking was an act of love made visible. His mornings now began in a penthouse office overlooking Austin's skyline, where he reviewed expansion plans with Sarah while sipping coffee from beans grown on a farm he had recently purchased in Costa Rica. The walls displayed framed reviews from national publications, photos with celebrity chefs, and the original handwritten recipes from his grandmother Rose that had started it all. But the centerpiece was a simple photo of Mrs. Henderson cutting the ribbon at the first restaurant's opening, her smile captured forever as the moment his new life truly began. The invitation to compete on Iron Chef America arrived on a Tuesday that had already brought news of a fourth location approval and a cookbook deal with a major publisher. Standing in Kitchen Stadium facing off against one of the country's most celebrated chefs should have been intimidating. But Robert felt only the calm confidence that comes from having survived real battles. When the secret ingredient was revealed as comfort food, he smiled knowingly. This was his territory, the culinary language he had learned to speak fluently in the darkness of his abandoned apartment. His victory on national television, creating a menu that reduced the celebrity judges to tears with its combination of technical brilliance and emotional depth, catapulted Robert into a different stratosphere of fame. The episode aired to the highest ratings in the show's history, with social media exploding in appreciation for the chef who had turned his grandmother's recipes into fine dining poetry. Food Network offered him his own show, publishers competed for his memoir rights, and restaurant groups from coast to coast begged him to franchise his concept. But success brought unexpected challenges that tested the man he had become. The constant travel between locations, media appearances, and business meetings left little time for the actual cooking that had saved his soul. Robert found himself managing spreadsheets more than sauces, approving marketing campaigns more than tasting dishes, and slowly losing touch with the intimate connection to food that had built his empire. Late one night, alone in his downtown apartment, he realized he missed the simplicity of cooking for Mrs. Henderson's book club. The solution came through an idea that Sarah called brilliant in its simplicity, a foundation that would teach cooking skills to struggling single parents, providing them with both practical life skills and potential career paths. The Rose's Resilience Kitchen program, launched in partnership with local community centers, offering free classes where Robert personally taught the recipes and techniques that had carried him through his darkest days. Every Saturday morning, he found himself back in a basic kitchen, teaching unemployed fathers how to make their children smile with homemade mac and cheese. These sessions reconnected Robert with his core purpose, reminding him that food was medicine for more than just physical hunger. He watched single mothers learn to bake bread with the same fierce determination he had once felt, saw unemployed men discover dignity in creating something beautiful with their hands, and remembered why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. The foundation also served as a pipeline for his restaurants, with several program graduates joining his kitchen teams and bringing their own stories of redemption to the workplace. The ripple effects extended beyond Austin as other cities requested their own Rose's Resilience Kitchen programs. Robert found himself consulting with community organizations nationwide, sharing not just recipes, but the philosophy that had transformed his pain into purpose. Food Network commissioned a documentary about the foundation, following several participants as they rebuilt their lives one meal at a time, with Robert serving as both mentor and living proof that the impossible was always possible. As the calendar marked the 2-year anniversary of his first restaurant opening, Robert stood in the original Grandma Rose's kitchen during the dinner rush, watching his team execute the choreography of service with balletic precision. Every ticket that came through represented someone seeking comfort, celebration, or simply a moment of joy in their day. He had built more than restaurants. He had created sanctuaries where food served its highest purpose. The broken man sleeping on a couch seemed like a character from someone else's story, but Robert knew that version of himself lived on in every dish they served, a reminder that transformation is always possible when you refuse to surrender your dreams. The phone call that would change everything came on a quiet Sunday evening while Robert was at home, practicing new recipes in his personal kitchen and enjoying the rare luxury of cooking without deadlines or critics watching. Sarah's voice carried an excitement he had learned to recognize as the precursor to life-altering opportunities. "Robert, you need to sit down," she said, barely able to contain herself. "James Beard Foundation just called. You're not just nominated anymore. You've won. Outstanding Chef in America. The youngest winner in 20 years. The wooden spoon he'd been holding clattered to the floor as the magnitude of her words sank in. The James Beard Award represented the culinary world's highest honor, the Oscar of the food industry that Robert had dreamed about since his days as a line cook in other people's kitchens. But more than personal recognition, it validated every choice he had made since Patricia walked out of his life. The award ceremony in Chicago became a celebration not just of his technical skills, but of the philosophy that had driven his rise. That food could heal both the cook and the consumer when prepared with genuine love and respect for the craft. Standing on stage accepting the award, Robert looked out at an audience filled with the most respected chefs in America and felt his grandmother's presence as strongly as if she were sitting in the front row. "This award belongs to everyone who has ever felt broken and found healing in the simple act of feeding others," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Food is love made visible, and tonight we celebrate not just what we cook, but why we cook." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with many chefs visibly moved by words that spoke to their own journeys through the demanding world of professional cooking. The media attention following the award catapulted Robert into the rarefied air of celebrity chefs, but unlike many of his peers, he used his platform to shine light on issues beyond the glamorous side of the food world. He testified before Congress about food insecurity, partnered with major retailers to bring affordable fresh ingredients to underserved communities, and expanded the Rose's Resilience Kitchen program to 50 cities across America. His memoir, From Broken to Beautiful, A Chef's Journey Through Heartbreak to Healing, became a New York Times bestseller and inspired thousands of readers to pursue their own dreams, despite seemingly impossible odds. The book tour brought Robert face to face with people whose stories mirrored his own journey through abandonment and rebuilding. In bookstores and community centers across the country, he met single parents working multiple jobs, recently divorced men starting over at 50, and young people who had lost everything but refused to lose hope. Each conversation reinforced his belief that food was just the vehicle. The real magic happened when people discovered their own resilience through the act of creating something beautiful with their hands. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A letter from the mayor of Austin, officially declaring October 15th as Robert Miller Day, in honor of his contributions to the city's culinary landscape and community development. The ceremony took place at the original Grandma Rose's kitchen, with Mrs. Henderson cutting a ceremonial cake she had baked using Robert's own recipe for his grandmother's pound cake. "Honey," she whispered to him as photographers captured the moment, "Rose would be so proud of the man you've become." The financial success had reached levels that seemed almost abstract. The restaurant group was valued at $40 million. His personal net worth had crossed into 8 figures, and investment opportunities poured in from around the world. But the number that mattered most to Robert was simpler. Over 3,000 people had graduated from Rose's Resilience Kitchen programs, with 85% finding stable employment in the food industry or starting their own small businesses. The broken man who had once stirred soup with tears falling into the pot had become a beacon of hope for others navigating their own storms. As autumn painted Austin's skyline in shades of gold and crimson, Robert stood on the rooftop terrace of his flagship restaurant, watching the city he loved come alive for another evening. Food trucks lined the streets below, their young owners pursuing the same dreams that had once driven him to cook in his living room. The cycle of hope and heartbreak and healing continued, and he was grateful to play a small part in showing others that the darkest moments often preceded the most beautiful dawns. The journey from abandoned husband to celebrated chef felt both impossible and inevitable, like a story that had been written by forces beyond his control, but executed by his own relentless determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, Robert Miller allowed himself to simply stand in gratitude for the long, painful, beautiful road that had led him home to himself. The unexpected challenge arrived in the form of a global pandemic that forced restaurants across America to close their dining rooms, threatening the very foundation of the empire Robert had built from nothing. Within 48 hours of the shutdown orders, he had to lay off 230 employees across all locations, knowing that each termination represented a family suddenly thrust into the same uncertainty he had once faced. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had risen from delivering meals from his apartment now faced the possibility of losing everything to circumstances beyond his control. But the years of building Rose's Resilience Kitchen had taught Robert to see crisis as opportunity for those willing to act decisively. While other restaurants struggled to adapt to takeout and delivery models, he immediately pivoted his entire operation toward feeding the communities that needed it most. The commercial kitchens that had produced elegant dining experiences were retooled to create thousands of family meal packages for distribution through food banks, homeless shelters, and community centers. "We're not just keeping our kitchens alive," he told his remaining staff during an emotional video conference. "We're keeping hope alive." The Grandma Rose's Community Kitchen Initiative became a model for pandemic response, providing free meals to healthcare workers, unemployed families, and anyone struggling to put food on the table. Robert personally delivered meals to COVID-19 wards, wearing full protective equipment while handing out containers of his grandmother's chicken soup to exhausted nurses and doctors. The sight of the James Beard Award winner serving food in hospital parking lots inspired other chefs nationwide to follow his example, creating a movement that fed millions during the darkest months of the crisis. Corporate partnerships emerged as companies sought meaningful ways to support their communities during the lockdown. Tech giants, sports teams, and entertainment companies began sponsoring thousands of meals per week, allowing Robert to rehire most of his laid-off workers and transform the crisis into the largest charitable feeding program in Austin's history. The foundation received donations from around the world, including an anonymous gift of $5 million from a cryptocurrency billionaire who wrote simply, "Your food saved my life during a dark time. Now let it save others." The pandemic also accelerated Robert's evolution as a media personality and thought leader. His Instagram cooking videos initially started to keep his brand visible during the shutdown, became appointment viewing for millions of people stuck at home and seeking both culinary guidance and emotional comfort. His live cooking sessions, where he prepared simple meals while discussing resilience, mental health, and finding purpose in service to others, regularly drew audiences larger than many television shows. Food Network offered him a permanent time slot, but Robert chose to keep his content free and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis deepened his relationship with Sarah, who had proven herself to be more than just a business partner during the months when their restaurant empire hung by a thread. Their late-night strategy sessions in empty dining rooms gradually revealed shared values that extended far beyond profit margins and expansion plans. The woman who had initially invested in his story became someone who helped him write new chapters, and their professional partnership evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. When dining rooms finally reopened, Grandma Rose's kitchen locations were not just surviving, but thriving in ways that surprised even Robert. The community goodwill generated during the pandemic translated into fierce customer loyalty, with many diners choosing his restaurant specifically because of their commitment to social responsibility. The wait list for tables stretched months into the future, and food critics noted a new depth and intentionality in the menu that reflected Robert's growth as both a chef and a human being. The most touching validation came in the form of handwritten letters from people whose lives had been touched by the Community Kitchen program. A nurse wrote about crying tears of gratitude when Robert personally delivered soup during her 12-hour COVID shifts. A single father described how the free family meals had helped him avoid choosing between feeding his children and paying rent. an elderly woman living alone, shared that the weekly meal deliveries were often her only human contact during months of isolation. Each letter reinforced Robert's understanding that success wasn't measured in awards or revenue, but in the number of lives touched by love made visible through food. As the second anniversary of the pandemic approached, Robert stood in his flagship restaurant's kitchen, watching his team prepare for another sold-out evening. The space hummed with the same energy that had always defined great kitchens, but now every dish carried additional weight, the knowledge that they had survived an existential threat and emerged stronger, more purposeful, and more connected to their community than ever before. The man who had once cooked alone in desperation now led a movement that proved the transformative power of feeding others, especially during their darkest hours. The moment Robert had never allowed himself to imagine arrived on a rainy Thursday evening in late November. When Patricia Williams walked through the front doors of Grandma Rose's kitchen during the height of dinner service. She stood in the entrance wearing a wrinkled dress that had seen better days, her once perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months without proper sleep. The hostess, unaware of the history walking through their doors, greeted her with the same warm professionalism extended to every guest. But Patricia's gaze was fixed on the open kitchen where Robert commanded his team with the quiet authority of a conductor leading a symphony. He spotted her immediately, his hands never pausing in their precise plating of the evening's special, while his mind processed the impossible sight of the woman who had once called him a failure, standing in his temple of success. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished somehow, as if the confidence that had once radiated from her like armor had been slowly stripped away by circumstances he could only guess at. The dining room around them buzzed with the conversations of Austin's elite, celebrities, and food lovers who had traveled from around the world to experience what food critics called the most emotionally transformative restaurant in America. Patricia waited at the hostess stand for nearly 20 minutes, clearly hoping to catch Robert's attention. But he continued working with the focused intensity that had made him famous. Only when the last plate of the dinner rush had been sent out did he finally emerge from the kitchen, his chef's coat pristine white and his presence commanding the kind of respect that comes from building something magnificent from nothing. The dining room seemed to quiet slightly as diners recognized the chef whose story had inspired millions, unaware they were about to witness a moment that would complete his remarkable journey. "Hello, Robert," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the sharp confidence he remembered from their last conversation. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small purse, and he noticed the absence of the engagement ring Dr. Thompson had given her, replaced by a pale band of skin that told its own story of disappointment and loss. I heard about your success. I read the articles. I saw you on television." The words came out in a rush, as if she had rehearsed them countless times, but still couldn't quite believe she was saying them to the man she had once dismissed as worthless. "Patricia." His voice was steady, professional, the tone he used with vendors and business partners, rather than the intimate warmth he once reserved for her. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service, but Robert's staff could sense something significant happening as their chef stood face to face with a woman whose presence seemed to diminish her with every passing second. "How are you?" The question carried no warmth, no invitation for a longer conversation, just the polite inquiry one might make to a stranger. The story tumbled out of her in broken pieces. Dr. Thompson's medical practice had been a facade covering massive debts and multiple malpractice suits. The wedding had been called off when federal investigators froze his assets, leaving Patricia alone with her own substantial debts from wedding preparations and a lifestyle she couldn't afford on a nurse's salary. She had lost her apartment, moved in with her sister, and been working double shifts at a community health clinic just to make ends meet. "I made a terrible mistake, Robert. I threw away the best thing in my life for someone who turned out to be nothing. I'm sorry to hear about your troubles," Robert replied, his tone maintaining the same careful distance. Behind him, the kitchen staff continued their closing procedures, occasionally glancing toward their chef with protective concern for a man they respected deeply. but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." The words weren't cruel, just honest, delivered with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to value his own worth after years of having it questioned. Patricia's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked around the restaurant that represented everything she had once told him he would never achieve. I thought maybe we could try again. I know I hurt you, but I've learned from my mistakes. I could help you with the business side, use my medical background for the foundation work." Her voice trailed off as she saw the expression on his face. Not anger or hatred, but something far worse. Complete indifference to her pain. Robert looked at the woman who had once defined his worth and felt nothing but a distant sadness for the choices that had led her to this moment. "Patricia, I wish you well. I truly do. But that chapter of my life ended the day you walked out of our apartment. I'm not the same man you left, and I wouldn't want to be. I've built something beautiful here, and it doesn't include going backward." He gestured slightly toward the dining room where Sarah Chen sat at their regular corner table, reviewing expansion plans while waiting for him to finish his conversation. "I have a life now that I'm proud of, with someone who believed in me when I had nothing to offer but hope." The finality in his voice seemed to break something in Patricia, and she nodded through her tears, understanding that she was witnessing not just rejection but justice. She had discarded a diamond thinking it was worthless glass, and now she stood empty-handed while he wore his success like a crown. "I'm proud of you, Robert. I always knew you had it in you." The lie hung in the air between them, pathetic in its transparency, as she turned toward the door with the slow movements of someone carrying an unbearable weight. As Patricia disappeared into the rainy Austin night, Robert stood motionless for a moment, processing the strange closure of seeing his former life walking away from his new one. Then he straightened his shoulders, smoothed his chef's coat, and walked toward Sarah's table with the confident stride of a man who had finally, completely, learned to value himself. The woman who had once broken his heart had inadvertently given him the greatest gift possible. The absolute certainty that he was worth more than her limited vision had ever been able to see. The morning after Patricia's visit brought a flood of clarity and energy that surprised Robert with its intensity, as if her appearance had somehow burned away the last shadows of his former life and revealed the full scope of what he had built from the ashes of their relationship. He arrived at the restaurant before dawn, not from anxiety or obligation, but from pure excitement about the day ahead and the future he was creating with each deliberate choice. The kitchen felt different somehow, not just his workplace, but his kingdom, earned through years of refusing to surrender to circumstances that would have broken a lesser man. Sarah found him there at 5 in the morning, perfecting a new dish inspired by a conversation with one of the Rose's Resilience Kitchen graduates who had shared her grandmother's Puerto Rican recipe for mofongo with braised short ribs. The sight of him completely absorbed in his craft, tasting and adjusting and tasting again until each element sang in perfect harmony, reminded her why she had fallen in love, not just with his business acumen, but with his relentless pursuit of excellence in everything he touched. "You're glowing," she said, settling onto a stool beside his prep station with 2 cups of coffee from the espresso machine that had become their morning ritual. "I feel like I've been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there," Robert admitted, setting down his spoon and turning to face the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. "Seeing her last night, it made me realize how far I've come, not just financially or professionally, but as a person. The man she left wouldn't have been able to build any of this." He gestured around the immaculate kitchen that hummed with precision and purpose, every surface and every tool reflecting his commitment to creating something meaningful rather than just profitable. The expansion announcement came that afternoon during a press conference at the original Grandma Rose's kitchen location, with food media, city officials, and business leaders gathered to hear Robert's vision for the next phase of his empire. But instead of focusing solely on new restaurant openings, he surprised everyone by announcing the creation of the Rose's Resilience Institute, a culinary school and business incubator that would provide full scholarships to aspiring chefs from underserved communities. "Success means nothing if it's not shared," he told the assembled crowd, his grandmother's recipes displayed on easels behind him like artistic masterpieces. The institute would offer 2-year programs combining classical culinary training with business education, entrepreneurship courses, and mental health resources for students overcoming their own challenges with poverty, addiction, or family trauma. Major culinary schools had offered to partner with the program, and several celebrity chefs had volunteered to serve as guest instructors. But the most meaningful endorsement came from Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, now 83, and still his most trusted advisor, who cut the ceremonial ribbon while wearing a chef's coat embroidered with Honorary Dean in golden thread. The financial commitment was substantial, $10 million to establish the institute, with ongoing operational costs covered by a percentage of profits from all Grandma Rose's kitchen locations. But the investment felt natural to Robert, the logical evolution of a man who had learned that true wealth came from lifting others rather than simply accumulating assets. The announcement generated headlines in business publications and culinary magazines, with many noting that Robert's approach to success was fundamentally different from the typical celebrity chef trajectory. That evening's dinner service became a celebration of everything the restaurant represented, with nearly every table occupied by people whose lives had been touched by Robert's journey in some way. Mrs. Henderson held court at her usual corner table, entertaining a group of Rose's Resilience Kitchen graduates who had become successful restaurant owners themselves. Food critics from national publications sat alongside local community leaders who had supported the foundation during its early days. The dining room buzzed with the energy of a community that had grown around shared values of resilience, generosity, and the transformative power of food prepared with love. The highlight of the evening came when Robert took the microphone to address his packed dining room, standing before an audience that represented every chapter of his remarkable story. 3 years ago, I was sleeping on a couch in a 1-bedroom apartment, selling meals out of takeout containers and wondering if I would ever be more than someone's abandoned ex-husband, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed restaurant. Tonight, I stand before you not just as a chef or a business owner, but as living proof that your worst moments can become the foundation for your greatest achievements. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause for his words, but recognition of a man who had transformed personal devastation into public service, who had built an empire not through manipulation or exploitation, but through the simple act of feeding people with genuine care and exceptional skill. As Robert looked out at the faces of everyone who had supported his journey, from Mrs. Henderson to Sarah to the kitchen staff who had helped him build something magnificent, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or fame and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. When the last customer had left and the kitchen had been cleaned to his exacting standards, Robert stood alone in his restaurant for a moment, surrounded by the physical manifestation of dreams he had once thought impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight he allowed himself to simply exist in gratitude for the long, difficult, beautiful journey that had led him to this moment of absolute certainty. He had become exactly the man he was meant to be. The final validation came not through awards or accolades, but through a quiet Saturday morning at the Rose's Resilience Institute 6 months after its opening, where Robert stood in the teaching kitchen watching 24 students practice knife skills with the same focused intensity he had once brought to surviving his darkest days. Among them was Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who had been homeless just 18 months earlier, now demonstrating julienne technique with the precision of a seasoned professional. Next to her worked David Kim, a veteran struggling with PTSD who had found healing through the meditative practice of preparing food for others. Each student represented a story of transformation that honored his grandmother's belief that food could heal more than just physical hunger. The morning routine had become sacred to Robert, arriving before dawn to prepare mise en place for the day's lessons, reviewing each student's progress in their personal journals, where they documented not just culinary techniques, but emotional breakthroughs and business plan developments. The institute had already placed 87 graduates in prestigious kitchen positions across Texas, with 12 launching their own successful food trucks and catering companies. But the numbers that mattered most to Robert were simpler. 0 dropouts, 0 relapses into the destructive patterns that had brought students to the program, and countless families rebuilt around the dinner table. Sarah found him in his office that afternoon, reviewing applications for the institute's expansion to Denver and Atlanta. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied essays from prospective students whose stories echoed his own journey through loss and recovery. The Today Show wants to do a segment on the institute for their series on innovative education programs, she reported, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had become both business partner and life companion. They want to follow 3 students through their entire 2-year journey. Only if we control the narrative, Robert replied, removing his glasses and looking up at the woman who had believed in his vision when it was nothing more than sketches on napkins and desperate hope. These student stories belong to them, not to entertainment television. If we do it to inspire other people who think they're too broken to rebuild, not to create content for advertisers. The protective instinct he felt toward his students surprised him sometimes with its fierce intensity, but he understood that vulnerability shared for the wrong reasons could become exploitation. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Dr. Richard Thompson, looking haggard and years older than his actual age, wearing a suit that had seen better days and carrying the defeated posture of a man whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled completely. He had apparently read about the Institute in Texas Monthly and driven from Houston specifically to speak with Robert, though his exact purpose remained unclear as he fidgeted in the reception area like a nervous applicant. When Robert finally agreed to see him, curiosity overcoming his natural reluctance to revisit painful chapters, the conversation that followed provided the kind of closure he hadn't known he needed. "I owe you an apology, Doctor," Thompson began, his voice lacking any of the arrogance Robert remembered from their brief encounters during Patricia's transition from one man to another. "I knew she was married when we started, whatever we started. I told myself it didn't matter because her husband was just some unemployed cook who obviously couldn't provide for her properly." The admission hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the casual cruelty that had helped destroy Robert's marriage while feeding the doctor's ego. "I convinced myself I was rescuing her from a life beneath her potential." Robert listened without interruption as Dr. Thompson detailed his own spectacular fall. The medical license revoked due to insurance fraud, the criminal charges that had resulted in 2 years of probation, the complete loss of everything he had built through decades of shortcuts and ethical compromises. "Patricia and we deserved each other, I suppose. 2 people who thought success meant taking what you wanted instead of earning what you deserved." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either man. The successful doctor who had stolen another man's wife had ultimately provided that man with the motivation to build something far greater than anything either the doctor or the ex-wife could have imagined. "I don't need your apology," Robert said finally, his voice carrying neither anger nor forgiveness, but simple truth. "What happened to my marriage taught me what I was really made of. Without that pain, I never would have discovered my purpose." He gestured toward the teaching kitchen visible through his office window, where students were practicing source techniques while laughing and supporting each other through the challenges of learning a demanding craft. "You didn't destroy my life. You accidentally gave me the chance to build the life I was actually meant to live." The conversation ended with Dr. Thompson asking about potential volunteer opportunities at the Institute, explaining that his mandatory community service hours could perhaps serve a useful purpose for the first time in years. Robert agreed to consider it, not from any sense of reconciliation, but from practical recognition that broken people often made the most committed advocates for others, seeking redemption. The man who had once represented everything Robert thought he lacked, status, financial security, professional respect, now stood revealed as exactly what he actually was. Someone who had built his identity on a foundation of sand. As evening approached and the Institute students gathered in the dining room for their weekly family meal, Robert watched them serve each other with the same care and attention they brought to their professional work. These young chefs had learned what had taken him years to understand, that true nourishment went far beyond calories and nutrients to encompass hope, dignity, and the radical act of caring for one another. Mrs. Henderson, now a regular dinner guest at the Institute, raised her glass of sweet tea in a toast that captured everything Robert had tried to build. To second chances, to finding family in unexpected places, and to the beautiful truth that love really is the secret ingredient. The final image that would stay with Robert forever came as he locked up the Institute that night and walked to his car through the Austin evening, past the original Grandma Rose's kitchen location where a line of customers still waited for tables despite the late hour. A young couple stood at the end of the line, holding hands and talking quietly about their dreams of opening their own restaurant someday, completely unaware that the man walking past them had once stood in line at unemployment offices, wondering if he would ever work again. The cycle of dreams and disappointments and ultimate triumph continued, and Robert Miller drove home to Sarah with the deep satisfaction of knowing he had become exactly who his grandmother Rose had always believed he could be, a man who fed people's souls along with their bodies, proving that the greatest success comes not from avoiding failure, but from transforming it into something beautiful and meaningful and lasting.